For this discussion, we have to discuss receivables, overview of receivables, okay? Basic concepts on receivables. First, we have a question: what is a receivable? So, when accounting for a receivable, we have to answer first the question: what is a receivable? So, basic concept for receivable is that it is an asset arising from contracts that gives a company a right to collect cash in the future. Okay? Simply, receivables are collectibles. Okay? But the important aspect for receivable is that it is an asset arising from contract. So, what are those contract? Ano yung sinasabing contract dyan? For example, sale. In a contract of sale, okay, the parties who are contracting there is the seller and the buyer. Okay? That the seller is willing to receive and the buyer is willing to give up an amount of money. Okay? For the goods that is subject of the sale. Okay? Also, example of a transaction, we have loans. Okay? So the lender is willing to lend money to the borrower, and the borrower is willing to pay back the money lent by the lender. So receivable, there is a contract. Okay? Obligor or obligee, seller, buyer, lender, borrower. Okay? So a party has a receivable. Okay? One of the parties has the receivable and it is an asset on its part. So it is a right, receivable is a right to collect cash in the future. Being a contract to receive cash in the future, okay, or right to collect cash in the future, receivables are actually classified as financial asset. Under PFRS 9, financial assets are examples of financial assets are receivable. Okay, a financial asset is any asset that is cash or any right to receive cash in the near future. Okay, so that is about receivables. So yan, diba? May sabi dyan, receivables usually arises from blank transactions. Parang may meme lang, no? Sabi ni buyer, seller, pwede ba favor? Bibili sana ako kasi wala akong pera. Pwede bang utang? So on the part of the buyer, umuutang siya. Okay? So if the seller grants the request of the buyer, okay, a sale transaction will be perfected. Yun nga lang, it is not on the cash basis kasi nga umuutang. Yung naka-capitalized letter dyan is yung utang, umutang. So usually, yung term na applicable for receivables are that receivables are arising from credit transactions. So credit transactions. Okay? So kaya yung sa mga problem solving, there is a term na sinasabing credit sale. Okay? Credit sale. Iba naman kasi yung cash sale. Cash sale is different because cash sale is really a sale with receipt of cash. But what you have with credit sale is utang. Receivable. Okay? Receivable. For example, an accounts receivable. It's an example of a receivable. Okay? You are giving credit. So a lender is giving credit to the borrower. Then the seller is giving credit to the buyer. Okay? So take note, receivables usually arise from credit transactions. There are two types of receivables. Okay? So we have trade and non-trade receivables. Pag sinabi nating trade receivables, okay, those that are arising from trading, okay, or other term ng trading, we have it buy and sell activities, either referring to goods or services. So there are entities that offer services or offer goods or both goods and services. Okay? So if a customer, wala pa siyang pambayad, okay? Then the entity can just bill. Okay? Can bill that customers, then recognize a receivable. Since we are engaging into a trade, okay? Seller-customer transaction, buy and selling, okay? So those receivables that arising from that transaction are considered trade receivables. Example of trade receivables, we have the accounts receivable. Okay, for presentation of other books and other problem solving, the term accounts receivable usually arise from transactions with the customers. Okay, open credit yan. So trade accounts receivable, then we also have trade notes receivable. Okay? There is a difference between yung accounts receivable and notes receivable. If the problem does not provide as to what is the treatment for the notes receivable, kindly look for information if the notes receivable is coming from the seller, from the buyer. Okay? If a seller receives notes receivable from the buyer, then that note receivable is a trade receivable. But if the notes receivable is coming from other parties other than the customer, then it might be a non-trade receivable. So we're talking now here with non-trade receivable. So what is non-trade receivable? Or what are non-trade receivables? So, kabaliktaran lang ng trade receivables. So, non-trade receivables are those receivables arising from activities other than trading and or buy and sell activities. Okay, these are receivables other than from customers. So, example niyan, we have the loans, we have the rent, tsaka yung royalty receivable. Okay, yung notes receivable, titignan nyo, depende kung kanino na-receive yung notes receivable, okay? Or yung promissory note. Because you will recognize that notes receivable, kung trade siya or non-trade, depende kung kanino mo na-receive. Kung kay customer, trade. Okay? Other than the customer, non-trade. Okay? Ayan. So, meron tayong, I have here summary of list classifications of trade receivables and non-trade receivables. So usually for trade receivables, we have the trade accounts receivable and trade notes receivable. Some presentation in the books will include installment receivable. So trade installment receivable. So those accounts, installment receivables are actually accounts receivable that are in the form collectible installment payment. Okay, usually for those who are engaged in installment basis of selling their services or goods, so installment receivable is also a trade receivable. Okay, so trade receivable, always remember referring to receivables from customers. Okay, for non-trade receivables, we have from loans receivable down to claims. Okay? Claims related to loss and damages. Okay? Rent, royalty, interest, dividend, receivable from employees, and receivable from affiliates like subsidiaries and associates. Okay? So claims related to damage, loss and damages, like mga insurance receivables like that. Okay? So take note for non-trade receivables other than from trading or buy and sell activities. Yun lang naman yung difference ng trade and non-trade receivable. For FX presentation naman, we classify receivables as to current and non-current. Okay? For FX presentation, take note regardless if it is trade or non-trade, it will be classified as the current or non-current. When do we say a receivable is current? Okay? Current receivables are those that are collectible within 1 year, whether considered trade or non-trade. Usually, trade receivables, okay, most of the trade receivables are considered current. Okay? But some trade receivables, like the installment receivable, okay, if the installment receivable, though trade, okay, there are instances na portion of those trade receivables will be collected beyond 1 year. Okay? But for current receivables, okay, always take note, collectible within 1 year. Okay? Within 1 year. So for problem-solving purposes, you will look into the collectible or the coverage of collection for that receivable. If that receivables are collectible within 1 year from the reporting date, okay, so for example, our reporting date is December 31. So count from December 31, if it is within 1 year, then current receivables. Otherwise, they are non-current receivables if they are collectible beyond 1 year. So from December 31 as our reporting date, counting from December 31, if it is beyond 1 year, okay, like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, so it is considered non-current receivables. Okay? Usually, non-current receivables are those related to non-trade receivables. But take note for current receivables, whether trade or non-trade, as long as they are collectible within 1 year. For non-current receivables, they are collectible beyond 1 year, and the usual receivables that are collectible with beyond 1 year are those non-trade receivables. Okay? So we have here summary of current and non-current receivables. So yung trade accounts at saka yung trade notes receivable are examples of current receivables. We also have current portion of rent receivable. We also have royalty receivable. Royalty receivables are always considered current. Also interest. Interest receivables are usual treatment, they are current because interest are related to a long-term receivable. So portion of the long-term receivable is interest. Interest is paid in an annual basis or collected in an annual basis. The same with dividend receivable, within 1 year lang yan. Receivable from employees, receivable from employees. Then we have current portion of long-term receivables. So for example, if your long-term receivable, portion of it will be collected within 1 year, especially if that long-term receivable is an installment, payable in an installment basis. So portion of that long-term receivable will be considered current if collectible within 1 year from the reporting date. Okay? Then, portion of that long-term receivable na collectible beyond 1 year are considered non-current receivables. Okay? Then we also have receivable from affiliates. Okay? Receivable from affiliates. When we say affiliates, related parties. Related parties just like sister companies, associates, or subsidiaries. Okay? So claims related to damages such as insurance claim, usually they are non-current. And bonds receivable. Bonds receivable is actually part of our topic, bond investment. Part of our investment na topic sa unit 4. Okay? So take note for non-current receivable, collectible more than 1 year from the reporting date. Yun lang naman yung difference ng dalawa. Okay? Current receivables, regardless if it is trade or non-trade, consider it as current if collectible within 1 year. Non-current, usually they are non-trade as long as collectible more than 1 year. Okay. Accounting measurement. So after determining what are the types of receivables, so how do we measure receivables? Okay? Sabi sa PFRS 9 or sa PAS 32 for financial asset, a financial asset at amortized cost are measured and accounted for at amortized cost. Okay? So receivables are financial asset classified as amortized cost. Okay? Financial asset at amortized cost. But for specific accounting talaga for receivables, like short-term receivables, long-term receivables, interest-bearing, and non-interest-bearing, for initial measurement, both short-term and long-term receivables are measured at face value. Okay, what is face value? Okay, it is the transaction price at the date of transaction resulted from the arising of the receivable. Okay? So face value, kung ibig sabihin ng face value yung actual amount involved in that transaction. So kung 1 million, 1 million yung kanyang face value. Okay? Short term or current, long term or non-current. Okay? Long term or non-current. But for long term na non-interest bearing, okay, non-interest bearing receivables, they are initially measured at present value. When we say present value, it is the discounted value of future cash flows using a discount rate. Usually, interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing is related to notes and loans receivables. Also, we have lease, but regardless of the type of receivable, whether short-term or long-term, interest-bearing or non-interest-bearing, subsequent measurement will always be at amortized cost. Okay, amortized cost. Ano ibig sabihin ng amortized cost? It is the balance of the receivable after deducting all collections, write-off, and allowances for uncollectibility. Okay? Usually, yung meron lang mga allowance for uncollectibility, yung usual with allowance for uncollectibility, accounts receivable, loans, notes, ganyan. Okay? So for short-term receivables, like those receivables arising from customers, meron din yung mga allowance for uncollectibility. Okay? So we're going to discuss. So let us have this example. Okay, let us have this example. Sabi dito, Fabem2 company reported the following receivables as of December 31, 2019. Yung requirement sa atin is to classify each receivable to trade or non-trade and classify it as to current or non-current, short-term or long-term. Yung pagsagot nito guys is to qualify each item of receivable. So how do we classify this one? Yung ating accounts receivable from customer, okay? Take note ha, receivable from customer, accounts receivable from customer, considered yan guys as trade receivable. Considered yan guys as trade receivable. Being trade receivable, considered din yan as current asset. So you may take note, accounts receivable from customer, yung 1,500,000, pwede niyong i-take note trade and current or trade current. Okay? Trade current. Next, yung notes receivable naman from customers na tawag nito short term, nakalagay dyan guys, short term. Sabi sabihin current, automatic current. Since yung notes receivable natin coming from customer, trade receivable din yan. So yung 2 million, yung classification niya, trade and current. Okay, so iti-take note nyo yung 2 million trade and current. Okay? The next, notes receivable from other parties. At the end of 3 years pa yung collection. Okay? Other parties, ibig sabihin, coming from other parties other than customers. So, ibig sabihin, considered na siya as non-trade. So, yung 3 million natin, ika-classify natin siya as non-trade. Since at the end of 3 years pa siya makokollect, considered siya as non-current. So, si 3 million, pwede nyo i-note, non-trade, non-current. Okay, non-trade, non-current. Next, interest receivable related to notes receivable for 3 years, 10%. Okay? Yung interest receivable natin na 300,000, related daw siya dun sa notes receivable na collectible in 3 years. Yung collectible in 3 years, yung notes receivable. Pero, yung, tawag nito, yung interest receivable, yung interest receivable natin, always current yan. Always current. So therefore, current receivables, interest, since yung interest receivable is referring sa notes receivable from other parties, considered siya as non-trade. Okay? So yung 300,000 na interest receivable is non-trade current. Okay? Non-trade current. So iti-take note nyo, non-trade current. Next, loans receivable, 5 years, collectible for 500,000 each year, starting December 31, 2020. So yun yung ibig sabihin niyan. Si loans receivable natin, good for 5 years siya, meaning collectible for 500,000 each year, meaning installment yung ating pag-collect sa kanya. Utay-utay. Paano yung pag-collect sa kanya? 500,000 each year. Good for 5 years. So for 5 years, each year magko-collect tayo ng 500,000. Yung first collection natin daw ng 500,000 magso-start sa December 31, 2020. So from December 31, 2019, kasi yung reporting date natin is December 31, 2019, from December 31, 2019 to December 31, 2020 is equivalent na yan guys ng 1 year. So, yung 500,000 is current and the remaining ng 2,500,000 which is yung 2 million non-current na. Okay? But both are non-trade. So, itong classification natin kay loans receivable. Yung first 500,000 is non-trade current. Non-trade current. Out of 2,500,000, 500,000 is non-trade current. Then yung remaining na 2 million is non-trade non-current. Okay? Next, interest receivable related to loans receivable. Okay? So another interest. Okay? The same application kanina ng interest related to loans receivable. Non-trade current. So yung 300,000 dyan is non-trade current din. Okay? Next, rent receivable for 5 years. Collectible 100,000 every year starting December 31, 2020. Parang the same sa loans receivable natin. Yung rent receivable na 500,000, 100,000 mako-collect daw each year. So for 5 years, every year meron tayong i-collect na 500,000. So yung classification natin kay rent receivable is non-trade. So yung 100,000, yung first 100,000 na pwede nang makolekt within 1 year is non-trade current, and yung remaining na 400,000 is non-trade, non-current. Okay? So yun yung ating rent receivable. Again, yung first 100,000 non-trade current, yung remaining 400,000 non-trade, non-current. Then yung royalty receivable naman, yung royalty receivable, okay, non-trade current. Okay? Non-trade current. Dividend receivable. Dividend receivable is non-trade current. Non-trade current. Receivable from employees. Receivable from employees, non-trade current. Okay? Non-trade current. Then receivable from associates and subsidiaries, or commonly yung sinabi natin kanina, receivable from affiliates. Associates and subsidiaries are also termed as affiliates. Yung 1,550,000 is non-trade, non-current. Non-trade, non-current. Automatic yan. Insurance claims from loss and damages sustained within 3 years. Ayan. Yung 1,850,000 dyan is non-trade, non-current. Okay? Non-trade, non-current. So I hope na take note nyo yung ating classifications for each item. So yung solution natin dyan, ganito. If you will observe, yung ating trade receivable lang is the first 2 receivables. Yung coming from customers lang. But other than that, starting from the notes receivable from other parties down to insurance claims, non-trade receivable na. Okay? Non-trade receivable na. Okay? So take note of that. Next, referring naman sa current and non-current, yan yung sinasabi ko sa inyo kanina, na regardless if it is trade or non-trade, as long as collectible siya within 1 year, current na siya. Okay? Yung interest receivable, royalty receivable, dividend receivable, and receivable from employees, they are automatic current. Okay? So other than from customers, yung naging current natin is yung interest receivable from the notes receivable na from other parties. Then yung loans receivable na 500,000 na collectible within 1 year from December 31, 2019. Then another interest receivable related sa loan. Then yung rent receivable natin, 100,000 is current kasi starting December 31, 2020, which is 1 year from 2019. Then royalty receivable, dividend, and receivable from employees. All other are considered non-current. So yung loans receivable, yung 2 million niya, non-current. Yung rent receivable, yung 400,000 niya is non-current. Yung buong notes receivable from other parties, after 3 years pa kasi, so buong 3 million yung non-current. Then yung receivable from associates at saka yung insurance, automatic yan, non-current. Okay? So that's it.